Welcome to the Reconstructing Inclusion podcast. My name is Omri Johnson, your host. Season 3 of the Reconstructing Inclusion podcast will be focused on opening up dialogue about a way forward in the diversity and inclusion space that's focused more on who we are than what we ascribe to one another. It will be about shifting patterns and practices we've come to adhere to in the space, examining them with fresh eyes in the current climate, about principles the work has revolved around, and why and what principles we might need to consider anew. About exploring our thinking, how we are making meaning of our workplaces and the world around us in the most curious ways we can. How we listen with skill, openly learn, create the conditions that allow colleagues to know they matter. Greetings, folks. Omri here. Let's jump right in. Trump administration abandons anti-DEI court battle, but the damage has already been done. That headline has been everywhere. People have been pontificating about it like it's some kind of surprise. And the framing is interesting because it assumes the real drama was always legal, as if inclusion was going to live or die based on what happened in a courtroom. As we know, it wasn't. Many people in the field, including those who helped amplify the distraction, already knew that DEI initiatives, even the ones heavily focused on representation, weren't illegal. What they were was politically expedient. And frankly, they became politically expedient partly because many people in the DEI space didn't question their own approaches in a way that would have required real change. And I get it. Real change, or change generally, is hard, but living with change that gets forced on you, like many have this past year, including myself, is harder. So instead, we watched a lot of energy go into worrying about the Trump administration's assertions. We watched people rewrite language, seek legal cover, try to figure out whether DEI could survive judicial scrutiny. But legality was never the core problem. While we were busy arguing about what would hold up in court, something else was happening inside organizations, quietly, steadily, and honestly, far more consequential. Sense-making was deteriorating. Trust was thinning. People increasingly felt replaceable. Alignment became brittle, and under pressure to do more with less, organizational health started to look fragile, maybe more fragile than in the past. That's the damage that's already been done. Not legal, organizational. So the question now isn't whether DEI was lawful. The question is whether we're willing to evolve the field, or whether we're just going to repackage the last 40 or 50 years of work and call it progress. And what I'm seeing right now, at least in much of the discourse, leans heavily toward repackaging. So today, I want to talk about why that won't be enough and what inclusion actually has to become if organizations want to remain capable in the world they're already living in. When people say the damage has already been done per the headline of the Trump administration's dropping the anti-DEI litigation, what they usually mean is reputational damage, political backlash, legal risk. And yes, all of that is real, but it misses the deeper issue. The real damage is that many organizations have lost the ability to make sense of competing realities. They've lost the ability to hear uncomfortable information without freezing up. They've lost the ability to hold difference without rushing to solutions. There are no solutions. As Thomas Sowell says, there are only trade-offs. And organizations in many cases have lost the ability to decide well, robustly, under stress. People didn't disengage with the notion of DEI because inclusion went too far. They disengaged because the systems meant to support collaboration and connection stopped working. When people feel replaceable, that's not a morale issue, that's a structural signal. When trust becomes fleeting, it's not about tone or tone policing, for that matter. That's about misalignment. And when sense-making declines, no amount of legal compliance is going to save the quality of organizational decisions. This legal spin that's been persistent probably since the first executive order last year, I think it was January 22nd, 2025, when the system began its deep, deep implosion. That legal turn was really predictable. That the pivot to legality at the time at least made sense. Boards care about risk. Executives want defensibility. Lawyers solve for exposure, and they did. They solved for exposure, and a lot of lawyers suggested, I imagine internally and externally, that you make sure you didn't do anything and you chart everything down so you can defend yourself, and then you slowly, I'd say, dilute what you were doing, even if it was something that was helping the organization. You dilute it just enough so that people don't think you had a preference, particularly because a lot of it was around representation, a lot of the efforts. Kenji Yoshino and David Glasgow's work and the legal industry more broadly stepped into that moment and did what law does well. If you don't know Yoshino and Glasgow, I'll share a little bit more about them later. They're professors at NYU, and they've been doing some work around fairness. They're both attorneys known well by taking Irv Gottman's work around covering and making it something that was popular mainstream over the past decade or so. So I'll talk more about them in a little bit. But they stepped into the moment. They were there. They were lawyers. They were saying what was legal, what wasn't. They were saying to boards what to do, what not to do, what to vote on, et cetera. And that's happened. So a lot of boards have rejected anti-DEI proposals that have come to them. And that's a bit of a setup too, as I think some of the anti-DEI people expected them to do, but we're cheering that on. It's fine. I'm not saying that we shouldn't cheer it on. And law did what law does well. It defined boundaries, it clarified constraints, it reduced uncertainty. Reducing uncertainty in a time where uncertainty is absolute, prominent feature or fixture. But there's a trade-off, and it's one that we have to be honest about. Legal frameworks tell you what not to do. They don't tell you how to think together. They don't help people surface competing truth. They don't build trust. They don't increase adaptability. We basically asked compliance to do the work of culture and capability. That's never going to work. More recently, we've seen critiques of DEI coming from inside the house. It's not just me anymore. Lily Zong's FAIR framework is managerial, it's pragmatic, it's legitimacy seeking for the DEI space. Lily Zong, for those that aren't familiar with them, is a very popular DEI practitioner, has written a few books, probably one of the most well-known practitioners on LinkedIn. And contrast that, or maybe even they're close enough to say we're comparing something that's down a similar trajectory. Lily Zong has this FAIR framework. Kenji Yoshino and Dave Glasgow's How Equality Wins is a legally durable, universalist, risk-aware book. They aren't necessarily the same arguments because they're responding to different pressures, but they share a timing problem, in my opinion, because a lot of these critiques are correct, and between the two frameworks, the critiques have some overlap. So they're not wrong, they're correct. But what's harder to ignore is that the warning signs for this were visible years ago. By 2021, by 2022, I can say it was even before that, but I know post George Floyd, the warning signals were so loud that I don't see how we ignored them. When I was drafting Reconstructing Inclusion, my last book, the concern wasn't backlash. My concern was stagnation. It was my sense that the field wasn't evolving fast enough for the complexity organizations were facing. And here's the thing that really came to me, and I think we can all agree to this. A field that stops evolving doesn't get taken down by its enemies. It collapses under its own inability to adapt. Let me repeat that. A field that stops evolving doesn't get taken down by its enemies. It collapses under its own inability to adapt. So what I'm saying here, and this is a hard thing to digest, I've had to do my own reflection on this. It's not the Trump administration that took down DEI in its entirety. The Trump administration came when it was politically expedient and then basically threw gasoline on a fire that was already burning. So I'm not questioning the frameworks of Yoshino and Glasgow or of Zong. So it's not about whether the frameworks are wrong, it's whether they're sufficient for now, and whether they're actually evolutionary or whether they're just stabilizing a system that's already failed under pressure. So let me say this plainly of how we went off the mark. DEI didn't falter because it demanded too much. It faltered because it demanded too little of organizations as systems. We were not thinking of a systemic approach. Now, everybody's talking about systems. It's really remarkable. I think that's what OD, organizational development, people do all the time. But DEI was talking about systems as if it was a system that was being imposed. Systemic racism is the closest we got to systems thinking, because in a way, talking about systemic racism said it was the system over there that was causing the problems to these people over here, rather than the system colluding to do this all together. Now, system never is about one piece. Everybody contributes to where we are today. And I'm not saying that as a blame placing mechanism. I'm saying it as taking full accountability for where we are, knowing that we have to go further. Let me share a little bit of how this occurred. Too often, comfort was confused with safety. Now, interesting thing, we talked a lot about being comfortable with discomfort. And maybe some people got there, but it was usually somebody that you believed that you were right morally in a place to tell them that they needed to be uncomfortable. As a DEI practitioner, anti-racism practitioner, anybody that followed Robin DiAngelo and Ibram X. Kendi, I know I pick on them a lot, but that's a lot of what that was. Like, you need to be comfortable with being uncomfortable. That's, to me, a bit obtuse, but here's the point. People started confusing representation with robustness. Moral clarity replaced inquiry. And what I mean by that is that there was a certain group of folks that felt they had a moral authority over other folks, oftentimes because they had disagreed with their assertions. And therefore, disagreement was treated as risk rather than data. As a practitioner, group, and sometimes organizations followed that simply because they wanted the noise to die down post George Floyd about racism. Inclusion became something to manage, a program to manage, a DEI program to manage, rather than something that built capacity for organizations to go through the time that we're going through now. And in doing so, the whole work of inclusion lost its connection to how organizations actually function. I don't think we were facing reality as clearly as we could. And when your mental model and reality are off, it's hard to get something to shift, because the shift oftentimes has to be not in the organization or not in the reality of the organization. The shift has to be in you. You have to be able to see that reality. When I say you, all of us, we have to. If we see the reality is this, and we're operating from a place that, oh, that's the wrong thing, and that's what's happening, because this is what's happening, that's reality. We don't have to like it, but it's happening. And so we need to be realistically saying, okay, this is where our mental model is, And now we want to shift the position of it. We want to go in a different direction. We want to change the vector. We want to change how we're moving through time and space in this construct and in our organization, whatever we call it. Fairness, inclusion, representation, equity. It still needs to be framed with reality. So this is where the emergent inclusion framework in my work in emergent inclusion as a whole comes in. I'm not putting emergent inclusion out there as a rebrand. In a way, I've been doing what would be called emergent inclusion, and I put that word emergent in it because I don't think I emphasized enough over the past few years in my work that if you build certain capabilities, you can adapt to what's coming. And I think what hit us right now is now we're trying to adapt to it, and that's fantastic. But we need to be reoriented to that reality of where your organization is right now. Not trying to cajole the organization to do more of the work that we did in the past, but saying, where does inclusion solve a problem that an organization's facing? A crisis of people feeling significant, a crisis of people being able to make sense with each other and connect, a crisis of being overwhelmed because there's fewer people doing more with less, and the potential for burnout goes up. Like, inclusion could solve for those things. We can do that. Inclusion at its core, a lot of it is about sense making, about making sense of the world, of each other, of our teams, of our organization, understanding that organization is all working in concert to create the conditions for everyone to do their best work and for the organization to fulfill on its mission. So when it comes to inclusion, let's ask these questions. Can people say what is? Can they talk about the reality versus just what's safe to talk about? Can feedback be treated as something that all of us should be asking for? That gift that keeps on giving instead of a threat. Even feedback about the way inclusion has been done over the past few years. I think the thing I love that's coming to the fore, and this is what Glasgow, Yoshino, and Zong are bringing out given their platforms, is that we can be critical of what happened. It wasn't so safe that long ago. I think I've lost some followers or some ability to interact with people because I've been honest about it. And that's something that I don't have any lamentation about. I want to have these conversations. I think they're opening up to say, yeah, we missed the mark and now we have to move forward. But I think it just can't be about something that makes us feel good and says we can go forward so we can get back on track. I think it needs to be about a reckoning to say, are we evolving the field by landing on these things, or are we just repackaging and presenting the same thing? Sometimes I say, old wine, new wineskins. So can people say what is reality, not just what's safe? Can feedback really be feedback, full stop, or people asking for it? They understand that it's something that's necessary, needed, and that we need it to grow, and we need it to learn faster in organizations. We need it to cut through the normalcy of uncertainty. That feedback allows us to move through that uncertainty together. Can differences or the distinctions we have between one another, perspectives, can they be mined for finding a nugget here and there? Or do we just manage it away? When we have this heterodoxy, this difference in perspective, you can call it diversity of thought for some of those. Can we really drill down? And sometimes that means your perspective is going to be wrong. In fact, it's better to probably just think my perspective is wrong. To something, related to something, it's incomplete. So there's some wrongness to it. So we want to be able to mine for those things that are wrong so we can get enough pieces of the pie, of the parts that are right that you say, the parts that are wrong that you say, and then start making a puzzle of that so that we can all move through, let's say, a labyrinth together to enter and be in the center of that labyrinth together because we saw which direction that we went in the past didn't work, which direction we're going now didn't work, and which ones do. We don't need to manage that away. And lastly, can organizations think together without collapsing into paralysis? We've had a lot of paralysis in our ability to work through stuff. Can we do that thinking together in a way that doesn't get us stuck? It doesn't get us stuck on one perspective or the other. We mind the perspectives, not manage them away. We think together, not get stuck on a fixed notion or a preference. When inclusion works, it produces better informed decisions. That's been my experience for a long time. It produces bolder action because when people can make sense with each other, they act in a way that actually gets you to where you want to be rather than just going on what somebody said because they might have had more power or influence, or they were simply louder in the room or in the team meeting. Bolder action means we've played with all these perspectives, all these angles in ways that organizations absolutely need today. When inclusion works, it increases retention through mattering. I'm going to be talking more and more about mattering. I'm working on something related to that. It's one of the concepts that I think is central to moving forward in the inclusion space. So when inclusion works, better informed decisions, bolder action, greater retention of stakeholders. And I'm not talking just about internal stakeholders. I'm talking about all those that touch in your organizational ecosystem internally and externally. Inclusion works. It increases retention through mattering. Everybody knows that they matter. And it builds the capacity to adapt and recover. We're going to take some hits. We're going to have some stressors, probably more than we've experienced before. I know that's what I'm hearing from people that I talk to regularly and what I'm experiencing myself. Inclusion works, better informed decisions, bolder action, increased retention through mattering, and better capacity to adapt and recover. That moves us away from ideology. It moves us in to infrastructure. It moves us in to creating something that structures that create the behaviors that we want to get the outcomes that we want to make the shifts that we need. And of course, fairness matters. Legality matters. But neither creates robustness on its own. So here's the question this moment is actually asking of us. Do we want inclusion to be defensible, or do we want organizations that can function under strain, under stress, under uncertainty? Uncertainty is not going away. Difference is not going away. Stress is not going away. Inclusion can be a doctrine we argue about after the fact. DEI can be this ideological notion that we argue about, that there's a pro and a con, and some are right and some are wrong. It could be about this issue and that issue. It can't be about a doctrine we argue about after the fact. It just can't. It has to be a capability we build before the next fracture point. The damage has already been done is a warning, but it's not a verdict. And what we do next will tell us whether we learned anything at all. I hope this was helpful. Make it a great day. Peace. If you are committed or simply a little bit curious about how to make DEI accessible to everyone, actionable, that is, unambiguously prioritized and sustainable, aligned with personal and organizational purpose, hit the subscribe button. Make it a great day. Peace.